So, who really wrote the Gospels? It's a massive question, right? And for something so important to literally billions of people, the answer, well, it isn't as simple as you might think. Today, we're digging deep into the historical record to find the very first person who gives us a real clue, a man you've probably never even heard of, Papias of Hierapolis.
Okay, let's get right to the heart of it. Here's the thing. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are technically anonymous. The authors never actually say, "Hey, I'm Mark, and I wrote this." Those titles we all know so well, they were added later. So you gotta ask, how did the early church decide who wrote them? And after almost 2,000 years, how can we be sure they got it right?
The biggest challenge is this gap in the evidence. The original manuscripts, the ones the authors actually wrote on, they're long gone. And there's this stretch of time between when the Gospels were written and our earliest copies that we have today. To bridge that gap, we need a witness, someone as close to the source as we can possibly get.
And this is where our main character, Papias of Hierapolis, walks onto the stage. He was pretty much in the perfect place at the perfect time to gather first-hand information. He's the essential link between the apostles and everyone who came after.
Now, Papias wasn't just some random guy with an opinion. He's known as an Apostolic Father. And that title is a really big deal. It means he was part of that first generation after the apostles. He either knew them directly or, at the very least, he knew their students. We're talking 1 degree of separation, which gives what he has to say some serious historical weight.
Look at this chain of testimony. It lays it out perfectly. You've got the apostles, then their direct companions, these guys called the Presbyters. And who's the very next link in that chain? Papias. He was in a position to hear their stories directly, which makes his account, well, historically, it's priceless.
And make no mistake, this guy was a serious investigator. He was buddies with a man named Polycarp, who himself was a student of the Apostle John. Papias went out of his way to track down people who had known the original apostles so he could get the stories straight from the source. He put everything he found into this massive 5-volume book. Now, tragically, that book is lost, but, and this is a huge but, later historians quoted pieces of it, and those little fragments are pure gold.
So what did Papias actually hear from all these sources? The answer is pretty revealing, not just for what he learned, but for how he went about learning it.
Papias tells us his whole method in this one quote. He basically says he preferred the living voice, direct spoken testimony from eyewitnesses or people close to them, way more than just reading books. He put his trust in the living, breathing tradition that was passed down person to person.
And get this, he was writing all this stuff down around the year 140. That is incredibly early. We're only talking a few decades after the last apostle John had passed away. This isn't some centuries-long game of historical telephone. This is immediate, next-generation stuff.
Right, this is the million-dollar question. With all this amazing access to early sources, what did he actually say about who wrote the Gospels? Well, the fragments that survived give us 2 absolutely monumental clues.
First, about the Gospel of Mark. Papias reports that Mark was the Apostle Peter's interpreter. He basically followed Peter around and wrote down everything he preached and remembered. Papias says his main goal was accuracy, even if it wasn't in perfect chronological order. This is the oldest piece of external evidence we have that connects the Gospel of Mark directly to the Apostle Peter.
And second, he talks about Matthew. Papias says that Matthew, the apostle, put together the oracles, which probably means the sayings and teachings of Jesus in the Hebrew language. This testimony is the absolute foundation for the traditional belief that Matthew's gospel comes directly from an apostolic eyewitness.
But Papias' whole focus on the living voice instead of just books, it has ripple effects far beyond history. In fact, his approach lands right in the middle of a huge theological debate that shaped Christianity for centuries, the whole idea of tradition versus scripture.
It all boils down to a fundamental question of authority. Where do you find the ultimate truth? Is it in Scripture alone, the principle known as sola scriptura, or do you find it in a combination of Scripture and sacred tradition, that living voice that Papias was chasing? His work just puts a huge spotlight on that tension.
From one point of view, Papias is Exhibit A for the importance of tradition. I mean, his entire method was based on it. He went looking for that continuous line of teaching handed down from the apostles. He didn't just grab a scroll and try to figure it out himself. He went to the community, the church, that was tasked with preserving that memory.
But there's a catch. As vital as Papias is for history, nobody thought he was perfect. Not even other early church leaders.
He had some beliefs that later historians thought were a little questionable. In fact, the historian Eusebius, the very guy who saved these quotes for us, didn't hold back at all. He called Papias a man of very small mind because he believed in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. It just goes to show you, even a crucial early witness could have ideas that the wider church would later say, yeah, no. It highlights just how complex it is to rely on any single person's interpretation.
So, with all that complexity, why is Papias still so indispensable? Why should this figure from the very dawn of Christianity matter to us today?
Because he is that bridge. It's that simple. He stands right at that critical point in history, connecting the generation of eyewitnesses to all the rest of us who came after. Without him, that gap in the historical record would be a whole lot wider and a whole lot darker.
I think this analogy just captures it perfectly. Papias' testimony is like hearing from the children of survivors. They weren't there themselves, but they are a direct, personal, and living link to those foundational events. That's the exact role Papias played for the early church.
So if you remember one thing, remember this. Papias provides our earliest, most direct historical evidence outside the New Testament for who wrote Matthew and Mark. He grounds our understanding not in some late-stage legend, but in the living memory of the early 2nd century.
And that leaves us with the big question at the heart of his life's work. Papias bet everything on the living voice of tradition. So we kind of have to ask ourselves, is faith something we're meant to figure out from a book, all on our own? Or is a continuous, living tradition, a living voice, an essential part of understanding it? The legacy of Papias makes sure we can't just ignore that question.